The press room was unusually packed, filled with journalists from all over the country, their eyes fixated on the young man standing behind the podium. Barron Trump had never been one to seek the spotlight, but today he had no choice. His mother, Melania Trump, had been the subject of relentless criticism, with headlines questioning her role, her silence, and even her dignity. For years, she had been called everything from distant to uninvested. But to Barron, she was none of those things. And today, he would make sure the world knew it. A reporter from a well-known network stood up first, voice sharp and pointed. "Barron, you've seen firsthand the criticism surrounding your mother. Do you ever regret being the son of Melania Trump?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. A hush fell over the room, cameras flashing, microphones angled to capture his every reaction. Barron took a deep breath, his face unreadable. Then, with a quiet strength, he responded, "Regret? Being my mother's son isn't something to regret. It's something I take pride in." The journalist raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting a more defensive response. "But considering everything, the backlash, the scrutiny, do you think she has lived up to the role of First Lady?" Barron didn't hesitate. The easiest thing in the world is to criticize from a distance. The hardest thing is to actually do something meaningful. I've seen my mother work behind the scenes, away from cameras. I've seen her dedicate herself to causes that most people only pretend to care about. She didn't do it for approval. She did it because it was right. A murmur spread through the room. Some reporters exchanged glances, realizing that this wasn't going to be the easy narrative they had prepared for. Another journalist leaned forward, emboldened by the moment. "Your mother was often criticized for staying silent during some of the most controversial moments of your father's presidency. Do you think she should have spoken up more?" Barron's gaze remained steady. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is wisdom. Just because someone doesn't yell their opinions doesn't mean they don't have them. My mother believes in action over words. She has never needed to perform for the media to prove she cares. There was an undeniable shift in the air. The usual tactics weren't working. The press, used to getting vague responses or carefully crafted statements, were now faced with something they weren't prepared for: genuine conviction. A voice from the back called out, "Your mother has been criticized for standing by your father despite everything. Do you ever question her choices?" For the first time, Barron allowed himself a small, almost incredulous smile. People love to assume they understand someone else's life based on what they read, what they think they see. But they don't know. My mother doesn't need to justify her choices to strangers, and I certainly don't need to justify them for her. The tension in the room was undeniable now. Some journalists looked down at their notes while others hesitated, unsure whether to push further. Another reporter cleared his throat. "Would you say your mother's legacy is defined by her role as First Lady? Or do you think she still has something to prove?" Barron met the question without hesitation. A legacy isn't built in 4 years. A legacy is built over a lifetime. My mother isn't finished, and neither is her impact. A female reporter leaned in, her tone softer than the others. "Your father has always been the dominant public figure in your family. Do you think your mother's voice was overshadowed?" Barron's response was immediate. "My mother never needed to compete for attention. She has always been her own person. Just because someone isn't loud doesn't mean they aren't strong. Strength is knowing who you are, even when others don't see it." The room felt different now. The press had walked in expecting a moment of weakness, but instead, they were witnessing something unexpected. A son standing firm in the face of relentless questioning, unwavering in his defense. A reporter near the front raised his hand. "You mentioned earlier that your mother focuses on action rather than words. Can you give us an example of something she's done that the public may not know about?" Barron exhaled slowly, considering the question. "She's visited children's hospitals without announcing it to the media. She's personally reached out to families struggling with opioid addiction because she actually cares, not because she wanted a headline. But that's the thing about people who do real work. It's not always on display for the world to see. And honestly, that's what makes it real." For a moment, the reporters said nothing. They had spent years painting a picture of Melania Trump that fit neatly into their narratives, but Barron was forcing them to reconsider. Then, from the side, a journalist spoke up with a question that sent a ripple through the room. "Barron, If you could say one thing directly to your mother right now, what would it be? The question was unexpected, and for the first time there was a flicker of emotion in Barron's eyes. He took a moment before answering. I'd tell her that she doesn't owe anyone an explanation, that she's done more than people realize, and that no matter what they say, I'm proud to be her son. The silence that followed was unlike any other moment in the press room that day. It wasn't just a lack of noise, it was the absence of resistance. The press, for all their angles and agendas, had nothing left to challenge. A final question came, quieter than the rest. If there's one thing you want the world to understand about Melania Trump, what would it be? Barron's voice didn't waver. That she's more than what the headlines say, that she's more than the assumptions, and that no matter what anyone thinks, she doesn't need anyone's approval to be who she is. The press conference ended shortly after that. Reporters lingered, some whispering to each other, others still scribbling notes. But the message had been delivered. Barron Trump hadn't just answered their questions. He had turned them back on the people asking them. As he stepped away from the podium, a few cameras still flashing, he knew one thing for certain. His mother didn't need defending. But if anyone thought they could diminish her legacy without a fight, they had just been proven wrong.